Let's now dive deep into what Photoshop filters are and which ones you'll need to know. There are quite a few filters. You can see if we click up here on filter, how many there are. And there are so many that I use very frequently, and there are so many that I never use at all. So we'll go one by one and learn about some of the filters one at a time. Let's start with the Liquify filter, as it is kind of a cool filter that I think is fun to learn. It allows you to warp photos and push things in and pull things out. So for instance, when a Photoshop retoucher is working on a magazine spread and they need to make a model look skinnier than they normally are in certain areas, this is exactly what they're doing. Okay, so we have our Liquify window up here. You can see here in this frame. Let's zoom on in on my face. So I have a photo here of myself, and maybe I want my chin to look a little thinner, remove a little bit of the double chin. So we zoom on into that. And here we have this thing called the pucker tool. There are lots of tools within the Liquify filter, and the pucker tool pushes things in, whereas other tools like the bloat tool will push things out. So here we have my pucker filter, and you can see that if I click and drag, I can actually pull things in very subtly. You might not even be able to tell that things are moving, but they certainly are. If you want things to move along a little bit faster, you can move up your brush size. Let's move it up to 25. And there, now you can actually see that I'm pushing things in. And the line isn't very smooth because I'm not being very meticulous for the class. But as you can see, this is what would happen. And we're just pushing things in here. Be mindful not to touch the hair because it will pull the hair into the face. But this is exactly how you can make your face and chin appear thinner. And then you can go through and use that patch tool that I told you about in the first class and remove some of these imperfections here. Okay, so if I wanted to use the bloat tool, for instance, to make my lips larger, I suppose I could do that. Let's get our brush size about yay big. Look at that. Huge lips. I'm going to look terrifying when this is over, aren't I? So this is how we would do that to make our lips bigger. And also, again, I would be much more subtle about this if I were doing this in real life. I would probably make the brush size much smaller and really zoom in and really be meticulous with this. But for this class, this is fine. We're working absolutely fine here. So if we go into our history window, I can kind of preview the way I looked before versus now. And already you can see my lips are huge. I look pretty ridiculous. I actually prefer the way that I really look as opposed to that. But, you know, you be the judge. The Liquify filter is so much fun. I encourage you to play around with it. Let's move on to the next filter. The next filter that I would like to go over with you guys is the blur filter. This one I use quite often in web design and just with editing photos. So sometimes you'll need to make things blurry for fun, and that's a good thing sometimes. If you go to Filter Blur, you can see all of these different kinds of blur. I prefer the Gaussian blur. That is my favorite kind of blur because it gives a nice even blur over the entire photo. And you can see if I up the pixels, it gets extra blurry and not blurry. And sometimes it looks really nice to have this subtle blurred background to things where you're changing from light to dark colors, or if I was using a photo that isn't black and white, you can get a nice mix of colors that way. I highly recommend it. But if we just want a subtle blur and put text over this photo, that could look really nice and would give a nice focal point to our text. But that's Gaussian blur. I'm going to cancel out of this and show you another kind of blur. For instance, we have the motion blur, which would make me look like I'm moving. I don't particularly like this one as it makes me feel dizzy, but it's up to you. You can change the angle of the motion so it looks like I'm moving up and down or side to side while this photo is being taken. I don't quite like this blur, but it's up to you on whether you do or not. Lastly, we could look at a blur that I really don't think you'll ever use, but I just want to show you that it exists, is shape blur. And it gives you the blur and the shape of this object that you've selected. And I'm not really sure what the application of this would be, but it is up to you on whether you want to use it. I think it's kind of strange, but you know, I'm curious to see if you guys find an application. Next up, let's go to Filter, Distort, and let's do some distortion. These are kind of fun to play with, but again, these are kind of filters that I never use, but let's play with them anyway. Let's go to Pinch. Now you might be thinking maybe this is kind of like the Liquify pucker tool that I was using, and it's really not. So just to show you, you kind of can't really tell what's going on if I zoom out, but if I apply this pinch filter and press OK, you can see it in our real photo, and look what it did to me. It makes me look like some sort of mutant. It certainly looks like I have a very tiny head and a large body. Okay, that's the pinch filter. And again, we can go into distort and try some of these other ones like ripple. And that gives a nice ripply effect to my face. Again, these look a little cheesy, but it's up to you if you like them or not. Again, filter, distort. Let's try, let's try wave. How's that? You can already see in this preview that it looks pretty crazy. But again, here's what it does. Let's move on to the next filter. The noise filter. All right, so we can add noise, dust and scratches, or we can even remove noise from our photograph. So this photograph, let's just try adding some regular old noise. So you can see as I turn this up, it's adding a lot of fuzz to make it look like our photo is grainy. If we add a subtle amount, sometimes it looks quite nice to make it look like this was taken with an old film camera. And that's generally what noise does. You can change it from uniform to Gaussian, which is just a subtle change to the speckles. Or you can change the speckles from being colorful like this to being more monochromatic, which I actually prefer. Just like that. So it turns our photo into looking a little bit older and more interesting. That is it for the filters that I highly recommend and use most frequently. Again, they are something that's a little cheesy if used in excess, but if you use filters wisely and really subtly, they can do some really wonderful things for your Photoshop designs.